Hi, Simply Vegas agent. Today we're going to go through how to correctly complete a listing agreement. Obviously, the listing agreement gets presented to your seller right after you've presented them with the duties owed, which, as we know, is the first form that they need to fill in. So going through a listing agreement, very simple, but very important that it's all put through correctly. Starting off at the top, it's the name of your seller, or if it's in an entity, it's the name of the entity, followed by who they are, whether they're a manager, if it's an LLC, or if they're a trustee, if it's a trust. If you have two trustees that both need to sign for a trust, both of those people need to be present. A lot of times if it's husband and wife, they're both going to be trustees. They both need to sign the listing agreement. Very important. Then we're going with your name and the company name on the next section along here. The next portion of this form is where the date of the listing is starting from and ending. You have to have a start and end date in a listing. If you present a listing agreement without a start and end date, you are in violation and you can get yourself into a lot of trouble for that. Then the details of the property go in here, the address, the county, etc., as well as the APN. It is extremely important that you put both in. One other thing to mention with this form is this is an ER exclusive right form. A lot of people make the mistake of listing as an EA or similar, which are also listing agreements available on transaction desk. Don't make that mistake. The majority of the time, you're going to be listing as ER. Next, we get to the terms of sale that deals with the price of the property. A very important field that must be filled in here also is the earnest money. That's got to be put in. That's what's going into the MLS when you list the property. This deals with types of financing. The things that are important here is if a project is FHA or VA approved. If it is not, you need to make sure that the boxes are not checked for FHA or VA. Then this is dealing with whether or not you can disclose to your seller to a prospective buyer about multiple offers. Next line talks about the property, the personal property that's offered for sale that's included. It's a great time to explain to your seller what is typically staying with a property and then listing it there. If there is a family heirloom that is excluded, the excluded portion of this form is a great place to fill that in. Items that can sometimes be leased are next along here, solar power being the most important thing. We find ourselves having a lot of issues with leased solar, so make sure you find out from your seller at that time whether their solar is leased or owned. Your commission is going in here, as well as, very importantly, how much you're offering to the other side. If you've got 3% in here and you fill in 2.5% on the MLS, you are in violation and you're going to get yourself in trouble. And then our transaction fee goes into the next box. Obviously, if this is leased, this is completely different. It needs to be leased with a leasing agreement through a property manager. So this majority of the time, the next portion is going to be non-applicable. Going down, when the compensation is due. What this paragraph says is if we are right at the end of a listing agreement and we're in escrow, you have X period of time to close that transaction without needing to go to another listing agreement. I typically put 30 days in there. This is not a holdover for someone where you can exclude another agent for a period of time from being able to take a listing. Next box that goes in here is the percentage per annum if they owe you money. Again, it's very rare that you're going to be owed money by a seller or if you've lent money your seller, and that's a whole different issue that doesn't necessarily need to be addressed on this form. The deposit section of here, our answer simply is it's always going to escrow. The deposits are never going to a brokerage in a sale. It goes straight over to them. Agency relationship section, that's dealing with the duties owed. The duties owed is the very first form that you had your seller sign. You already have a duties owed in place by the time you're going through this section of the form. Going through disclosures, etc., obviously extremely important. Wherever there's a spot for an initial, your seller needs to be initialing. Common interest communities, pre-fill in all of the information about a homeowners association. It is really easy to call any association and say how much are your HOA dues and fill this in before you present the form. It's lazy if you haven't filled it in. It's really easy to do. SIDs, same thing. They're very, very easy to go online and pull up how much an SID or an LID is and indicate whether or not there is one on the listing agreement. And then the balance goes in there. You're going to need that when you put it in the MLS anyway. And then when it's due, that's all available online. Next portion, if you're having a sign on the property, your seller needs to give you permission in order to do so. Lockboxes. This portion talks about whether or not you authorize a lockbox or key box. If this is marked does not authorize a key box, then the next portion of the form becomes moot or invalid because you're not going to authorize use of one-day codes if you haven't authorized a lockbox, etc. Going through to rental or lease of property, again, this deals with whether or not the property is currently occupied by a tenant. We need to make sure the tenant knows the property is being shown, phone number, etc. tenant, and that needs to be disclosed at that portion. Tax withholding. If your seller does not have a social security number or a tax identification number, they are a FIRP seller, Foreign Investors Real Property Tax Act. If they are a foreign seller, there will be a tax withholding at close of escrow if the property is more than $300,000 or is not being owner occupied and is less than $300,000. Going through, that's where the declaration goes in, has to be filled in if they are not a foreign investor or if they are a foreign investor, and it has to be initialed. And every single page of this form has to be initialed. Mediation. This portion requires a broker's signature, as does the last page of this form. If you do not have a broker's signature and initial on this form and then send it back to your seller, you do not have a valid listing agreement. It needs everybody's signature on it. If you're using DocuSign, then DocuSign your broker on this portion so that it will immediately get delivered once the form's completed back to your seller. Therefore, you've fulfilled your needs as far as that concerned. If you are signing in person, it needs to come back to the office, have a broker's manual signature on it, or you can send it to DocuSign at that stage, and then you send it back to your seller. Again, it is not valid unless it is delivered back to your seller. You do not have a valid listing if you haven't done that. Multiple listings, self-explanatory, gives permission to put in the multiple listing services, and then there's lots of other different portions of this. The opt-out section, there's a couple of simple things in here. One's an automated commentary and one is an automated valuation. A lot of the times people say they don't mind and the seller is not opting out, but again, at least one of those has to be initialed. Use of listing content, etc., verbiage that you'll all go through, make sure there's an initial at the bottom of the form, and then going through, if they have a notice of default filed against the property, they need to disclose it, they need to initial. It's incredibly important that that doesn't get missed. Signatures obviously gives permission to take digital signatures, and then going through making sure there's an initial on every single page. If you have any additional terms, that's the section that it goes in, and then the seller's information goes on here as far as their signatures, phone numbers, etc. Again, the form will auto-populate from the beginning of your seller's name. You need to make sure that you completely fill in the brokerage name, broker information, address, etc. on this last page. And again, this is where the broker's signature and your signature goes. It is not a valid listing agreement without all of those signatures. And there's an initial on the bottom of this. The fair housing portion, there's an initial on that has to be initialed by your seller. And that's it for a listing agreement. Thanks very much.